Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the Managing Director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As the title of this video suggests, we're comparing Thailand, sort of hopefully post-COVID or post-COVID response, might be the better way to put it, Thailand to the West. And I want to be clear on the context of this. I'm not talking about anything from the standpoint of medically. I'm not talking about things from the standpoint. Well, I'm talking about it more from the standpoint of socially and, more importantly, to some degree, legally. And the reason for this is I've read a lot lately. I've read a lot lately about various takes on the future of due process in the United States. And those who are unaware, the notion of due process of law, that folks need to have due process if they're going to have, life, liberty, or property taken from them. And COVID threw a lot of that out the window from my observation in the U.S. and from what I've read from people who've actually lived over there, where it was just sort of cast aside, the notion of due process in 2020 to a very real extent. In a very real sense, Thailand, within the context of the legal system here, the way I understand it and the way I sort of interact with it, Thailand actually did take due process into consideration. Now, due process is a slightly different thing in that they did undertake to promulgate, and go ahead and pass the emergency decree back in March 2020. And it initially was a temporary measure. It was presumed that that was going to end. It has gone on until now, when we're talking here, August, September of 2021. I think reasonable people can argue that this is frankly possibly gone on too long. We may be able to go ahead and go back to using standard practices to deal with this at this point. But again, not really the thrust of this video. Point being, there was a mechanism, due process of law in Thailand to deal with this. It was the emergency decree. And the emergency decree is not forever. It has to continue to be extended. It has continued to be extended. But, there is a certain point, presumably, where people are going to start asking, is this what we really want extended? Do we want to continue this? And so from the standpoint of due process, I actually kind of hesitate to say but I think Thailand has handled it relatively reasonably, at least compared to the West, especially certain jurisdictions in the U.S. where it was just like, well, governors can just do whatever they want, rule by decree. And I am being a little bit sarcastic, but not so much. I mean, there were literally situations where, folks, different office holders in the U.S. were in different states in the U.S. kind of acted as if they had some sort of imperium, which, quite frankly, they didn't have. The point of this video, though, is oddly an exercise in comparative law, or just kind of a brief discussion on it, because one thing that frightens me about what's happened, at least in the United States, I'll keep it kind of confined to that. You could apply this to the rest of the Commonwealth and to some degree Europe, I think, too, because the notion of precedent is very deeply ingrained in the philosophy, in the mindset, in the Western mindset. And basically it's this notion that, in a legal context under the common law, we use legal decisions made sometimes hundreds of years in the past as controlling for making decisions and adjudications in the present day. And the argument being made there is, by using precedent, it allows folks to kind of predict how things would play out. It gives people a better understanding of where they stand vis-a-vis the law or the interpretation associated therewith. And it also creates a kind of uniformity throughout jurisdictions where if you move from one common law jurisdiction to the other, you can at least be reasonably assured that certain things will be similar from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in sort of a common law context. Thailand doesn't use precedent this way. And again, I'm not a Thai attorney. I'm an American attorney. I'm a naturalized Thai citizen, but I'm not licensed to practice Thai law in the Thai courts. I assist as managing director here at the firm. I assist Thai attorneys in liaising with respect to different aspects of legal work that we have to do on behalf of clients. But one thing I have been able to do over the years is it has been like a constant exercise of comparative law. And this mindset of precedent does not so much exist in sort of Thai legal philosophy, Thai legal thinking. I'm not saying it's totally absent. You know, for example, Supreme Court cases here in Thailand are given a lot of weight, but they, you know, there are situations, they get distinguished much more often, in my opinion, just as an observer. They get distinguished much more often than, for example, Supreme Court decisions in the United States. So my point in making this video is, you know, some of the, for lack of a better term, worst reactions that came about in response, and let me be clear, in the government's responses to COVID in the common law world. You know, what really scares me is that they can be sort of enshrined as precedent to be used in the future, whether it's for a genuinely good purpose or whether it's for a legitimate purpose or not. You know, precedent has a tendency, you know, in the military world, they have that term mission creep. You know, you get into a situation and then the mission just seems to creep on. In a sense, there is kind of a precedent creep, and that's the way I think about it, where these precedents kind of build on one another. And when you look back on the original decision, it is one of the things that I, over the years, have found fascinating about a major change in my paradigm with respect to the common law. When I first came out to Southeast Asia, you know, my presumption was always that the use of precedent, so-called stare decisis in Latin, sort of let the decision stand. You know, this notion of, you know, it's an old decision, we're just going to go with that. You know, I took that at face value. I just made that as I just took it as presumption or as an assumption that that was the best way to do things. Over the years, you know, the civil law system in Thailand has showed me that there is another way of dealing with that perhaps, you know, a decision made 350 years ago by some law lord in Great Britain might not be the best way to deal with an issue in the modern day. If, you know, there's circumstances where you can argue it both ways. But one thing that I am cautiously optimistic about with respect to sort of the future is that Thailand doesn't have this inherent notion that precedent or having done something then sort of solidifies it, if you will, or legitimizes it for use in the future, just by dint of the fact that it's already been done. And the common law tradition does have that to some extent. There is to some extent an assumption or a presumption that if something has occurred, then, well, it might be legitimate for it to occur again. The point being, you know, some of the worst vagaries, perhaps, of, you know, some of the throwing out of due process, especially in an American context, I worry could be sort of congealed in folks' minds and, you know, could set the precedent for future issues down the road. The nice thing about Thailand is I do like that they take an ad hoc approach in a sense. They deal with the situation as it comes, and then once that situation is resolved, they don't necessarily say, well, these solutions are what we need to be using forever. No, they actually, it's been my experience that once the issue is resolved, they just sort of put that back in its own compartment. They may look at it in the future, but it's not, there isn't this inherent philosophical notion ingrained, this super respect for precedent. And in many ways, I hope that augurs well for the situation here in Thailand.